So good evening, everyone. Tim Cole is an Ottawa Valley native who is still an active pilot and aircraft owner with 58 years experience flying in Canada. He was chief pilot for Ottawa-based Laurentian Air Services and later joined the federal government's STOL demonstration program, Airtransit, that operated out of Rockcliffe from 1974 through 1976. For the last 45 years, Tim has lived, worked, and flown on the West Coast as a commercial pilot, civil aviation inspector, and recreational pilot. He was a COPA director for BC Yukon and also director at the BC Aviation Council. He is an aviation writer and columnist and has recently published his memoirs in the book Tight Floats and Tailwinds, Bush Pilot to Bureaucrat and Back. Tim also states his claim to fame is that he has 400 hours on Beaver No. 1, CF-FHB, that now resides in the Canada Aviation Space Museum. He also knew and worked with Patty Gardner, who is a founding member of CAHS Ottawa here. So everyone, please welcome Tim Cole.
Hey, everybody. Well, I'd really like to thank the Ottawa chapter of the Canadian Aviation Historical Society and inviting me. It's kind of special to address a hometown crowd, although I fanned things out pretty well, and I can see quite a few folks. There's Ray Hocko from he's in St. John's, Newfoundland. There's Alex Terziev. She's down in New York State. Dot Buckles up just south of Williams Lake. Margaret Downey's out here in Abbotsford. John Lang's on there. Jim Jorgensen. So there's quite a crowd from across the country. I'm not sure. I may miss some other ones that I know, but this is a real treat for me to be able to share my my memories and particularly of the Ottawa area in my early flying career. Okay, so let me just see on here. So that's Tim. That's quite a few years later than starting out in the Ottawa area. Gee, I see Jack DeBrise on there. My gosh, there's somebody from a long time ago. My stories are not unique. There's thousands and thousands of pilots that have walked the aviation path in Canada, and I just happen to have written mine down. And I called it Tight Floats and Tailwinds, Bush Pilot to Bureaucrat and Back. I was the tight floats and tailwinds. If you're a working float pilot, having a set of leaky floats, and every time you land is you got to jump out and pump the floats and get wet and haul around an extra weight in water. That's real misery. If you're flying 100-mile-an-hour airplanes, as most of the de Havilland airplanes are on floats, and you're spending 10 hours a day of chugging around hauling drums of fuel, fighting tailwinds and turbulence is again, that's not the greatest thing to have going. So to have a set of tight floats don't leak and to have tailwinds as you're motoring along is a real blessing. A lot of my time has all been in small airplanes in remote locations and or in coastal locations, in mountainous locations. And people often ask, well, isn't that a pretty risky business? And or the more direct question, well, have you ever crashed? So when I wrote the book, I decided I'd get that out of the way. And the first chapter is called Scary Stories. And I put four of my most memorable stories, excuse me, right out front. Yeah, there's a risk to flying small airplanes, but driving out on the freeway here, particularly in Vancouver or Toronto or Ottawa, and you don't know how well the machine is that's maintained beside you, or whether the fella next door has had a few drinks or he's been smoking pot or whatever. I think that's just about as high a risk. So yes, you operate complicated machines in remote places. Things are bound to happen, and I've had probably in 13,000 hours of flying, I've probably had about 30 or so. But I put this right up front to get it out of the way. So this is Grum and Groose in September 1972. And I was working the Caribou Hunt out of Shefferville, and personal pressures got a little high, and a 40-knot crosswind with tail wheel lock that didn't work. And I was trying to do one last trip before I could get home and see my son that had been born about 10 days, my firstborn son, 10 days before, maybe led to some bad judgment. So this is the only accident I ever really had, and thankfully it wasn't too bad. I flew the airplane out about 3 or 4 days later, and with a new right main wheel and some paint scraped off the hull and the right wing float, and a really bruised ego was the sum total of most of it. My first real job was in Western Quebec, flying fire patrol for the Ottawa Force Protection Association, and I thought I was really in the bush over in Labrador Park, about 150 miles northwest of Ottawa. That really is, it's bush country, but it's not that remote. But in the first 10 days of being on that job as the new guy on the block, I had a series of engine failures, and it took about 4 forced landings before they finally sorted out that there was a Duff carburetor on it, and that really wasn't finger trouble with a young lad that was new on the job. That's a Transport Canada Cessna 206 here on the west coast, an amphib. And in July 2001, I was flying a fisheries patrol. They did them at low level, generally at about 500 feet. And I was out in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, about midway, just about on the American border. We were looking at fishing boats when the engine on this 206 decided it was going to act up, and gave several big shudders, and I worked my way back around and was able to land at the Victoria Airport without without any damage or anything else. But again, that was one of those memorable ones. And then there was an Otter CF OTX in 1971. It wasn't a Laurentian Otter. It was one that we'd leased from Bradley's. Laurentian had pretty good good maintenance, and we had lots of confidence in our airplanes, but and our maintenance. But this was a South American military Otter that had sat in the jungle, and Bradley's had resurrected it, and we leased it for the summer. I had a whole bunch of issues with it a couple of weeks before we took it north to the Ungava area. On the ferry flight up there, I had an engine fire at the dock at Shefferville, and there was 2 complete cylinder changes on it, and it was finally deemed all set to go. And we were falling behind on supporting Geological Surveys of Canada, Bell 47 helicopters out near the Labrador coast. And so I had 22 10-gallon kegs of avgas in the cabin, and a full about 180, 179 gallons in the belly tanks in this thing. So this kind of a flying gas tank, this thing, and it developed an oil leak that went down over the exhaust, and I started trailing smoke. And another fellow flew up beside me, and he said, first he thought he could see oil, and then he says he's seeing smoke. He says it really looks neat, just like in the movies. So be still my heart, and landed the thing, and the story goes on, but it comes to a good ending. We went back to Ottawa, ferried it back to Ottawa, put a Laurentian engine on, and it went the rest of that season with no further problems. I was raised on a couple of farms, and I started operating machinery at a very early age. I'm on my dad's knee on the little Ford tractor. There's one of those Ford tractors there. When I was 8 years old, my dad and I took crops off of a 117 acre farm, and I did all the driving at 8, and he did all the bull work. The first farm I was raised on was in Westboro. So this is an Ottawa crowd, and I don't normally show the next couple of slides, but as this is an Ottawa crowd, I'm going to share it with you. And some of you may recognize this house. This is Maple Lawn. And my great-grandfather, Thomas, moved. He was a lumberman on the Quebec side, and he bought this farm in the west end of Ottawa, 320 acres. It ran from the Ottawa River to Carling Avenue. This house still exists. It was bought by the NCC, and it's a historic site now, and it's operated as the Keg Mansion. So any of you know the Keg Mansion on on Richmond Road in Westboro, it's still there. And it has old English gardens with it, and there's a group of folks that run these gardens for the NCC on a volunteer basis, and so some of you may recognize that. My dad was still farming this place up until 1950, and then we moved out to the Stittsville area, about halfway between Hazeldean and Stittsville. And for you Ottawa folks, if you recognize the Caboto's Italian restaurant on the old highway out to Stittsville, it was originally in the 1800s Kemp's Tavern, and this house was Harton House that was right across the road. We moved there in 1950, and my dad farmed it. We got burned out, and eventually moved back into the Westboro area onto another house that was on the family farm at the end of Golden Avenue, again in Westboro. So that just puts a little context into it. When I moved back into the city, I was a bit of a troubled teenager, and got into all the usual teenage problems, girls' football and partying were high on the agenda, not much on school. So I quit school when I was 17 years old, and was doing mostly labor work until I was 19, and I went out to CARP, and I took a $5 introductory flight on Bradley Air Services Piper Colt, and within 4 months I had a private pilot's license. I had maybe a purpose in life. I went back to my dad and asked him if I could go back to school, and I did, and passed with pretty good marks. It's amazing what about a year and a half on the end of a shovel will do to give motivation to a troubled young lad. So while going to school, I worked on my commercial pilot's license, again out of CARP, on Piper Tri-Pacers, Colts, Super Cubs, and old Apaches and all that kind of stuff. First time I was in a float plane was out of Constance Lake. A lot of you Ottawa folks will know Constance Lake. It was with Russ Bradley in a Super Cub. And Russ said, show me a stall. And so I showed him a stall, and things weren't quite as politically correct in those days, because I got an awful whack across the back of the head, and I was asked, whoever showed you how to do a stall like that? So that was part of the learning process. In 1967, I got my first real flying job with Laurentian Air Services out of Ottawa. They were a pretty famous old company, and they started in 1936 with Barnett McLaren and Walter Deisher. And the McLaren Pulp and Paper Company on over at Thurso and over on that side of the river, they wanted aircraft to patrol their timber limits, but they also developed a tourist trade. Now, I may get checked on my dates, but in the 1920s, Charles Lindbergh flew out of Lindy's Field south of Ottawa. One of his pilots was killed in an accident, and they called that Lindy's Field. And Laurentian bought this little aerodrome, and they had it for a couple of years. And then they sold it off to the Department of Transport, and that became Uplands Airport, and now it's the Macdonald-Cartier Ottawa Airport. When Laurentian sold it off, they took a long-term lease up in the northwest corner of the airport, just off of Hunt Club Road. And that was their base of operations for many years. I flew for Laurentian from 1967 through 1974. John Bogie is Canadian Aviation Hall of Fame member. He was pilot, a sportsman, and the airline owner of Laurentian. He was co-founder of the Canadian Owners and Pilots Association. And I worked for John, and over the years we became friends. And in later years, in retirement, I was on the a director for the Canadian Owners and Pilots Association, and John and I were pretty good friends, and not pretty good, very good friends. And he was a mentor to me when I was a young lad. When I was 26 years old, he made me chief pilot of his operations. We were operating about 20 airplanes, and that was pretty awesome amount of responsibility to be at 26, to be shepherding around about 25 pilots and a bunch of other guys, and all the things that go along with it. Laurentian's operations, they operated over a good portion of Eastern Canada and a little bit into the northeastern United States, but they were primarily operated in Quebec. And down in the lower left-hand corner, based out of Ottawa, Maniwaki, and Lac-des-Loups, they operated in there. And then if you go up into the right, up into the Labrador City and Shefferville area, we had quite a large base out of Shefferville, and worked on Gava and Labrador. Primarily the interior Labrador. We went out to the Labrador coast on occasion, but most of it was in the interior. This was my first residence in the bush, and when I first saw it, this an old E.B. Eddy camp at Bayneuf Mill on the headwaters of the Collonge River in Parc La Vérendrye. I thought it was sort of the end of the world, but actually it was a pretty good camp, and lived in there for 4 months, learning my trade and working in the bush. There's young Tim as a fire patrol pilot. we're based in the park, and so you couldn't get rid of nuisance bears. So there was up to 7 bears in the camp at any one time. Some of my stories I tell about bear stories, in particular about catching a live bear and just in an old horse stable just right next door to that. And catching a live bear is not a really good thing to do, but young lads sometimes aren't too bright. Laurentian had their operations were scaled back a lot in the wintertime, but there was still large ski operations. And I learned ski operations my first winter of 67, 68, flying Cessna 180 on wheel skis, all in Western Quebec. And that can be pretty challenging because you get some warmer weather, and there's lots of slush and some pretty challenging conditions in that area. In 1968, I was based out of Lac des Loups, a Quebec government camp in Parc La Vérendrye, to be the base pilot. And I had a lovely Laurentian beaver, well kept and everything else. And I spent part of the summer on it, but a contract came up further north where they needed a more reliable airplane. So they leased this airplane out of Calgary, and it had a nice paint job. But as you can see by the registration, as CFFHB, Fred H. Buller, this is the #1 beaver, the prototype. And even then, she was a tired old airplane, and she didn't fly quite like other beavers. If you got into rough water with it, it would the cockpit would shake from one side to the other. And but again, learning my trade, it treated me well. I had a lot of firsts in this airplane. My first armed conflict, supporting game wardens. I write it in my book. I tell a story about the lady that fell out of the airplane, resulted in the first time I went to court. We won, by the way, but it's a pretty catchy title, "The Lady That Fell Out of the Airplane." So it's it's an interesting story. First medevacs, first night landings, and with and medevacs on floats and unlighted areas, and all those sort of things. But I wasn't very happy flying this old airplane, but now this many years later, over 50 years later, it's pretty neat to be able to say, hey, I got 400 hours on FHB. There's been stamps and coins made of the airplane, and whenever I visit Ottawa, I got to make sure I go to the museum and give her a little pat. Winter operations, again, we didn't operate on straight skis with only a couple of exceptions. I think we had a Cub out of Maniwaki on straight skis, but we operated almost entirely on wheel skis. And winter flying is some of the flying that you can do if the conditions are right. But bad weather, snowstorms, cold weather, warm weather, and slush, all of those things can make ski flying pretty challenging. I spent several months in the winter of '69 outside of Val d'Or supporting the Anaconda American Brass, and taking them in to work every morning at 7 o'clock and bring them home at 4. And they'd probably do it with a helicopter now because you're only flying about 5 miles over the hill. But to get one of these round engines going at 40 below, it'd be starting at about 4 o'clock in the morning with blow pots and all the accoutrements to either scrape frost off the wings or struggle with wing covers and all the things that go along with it. And of course, fueling from drums. In the bush, you're either hauling drums or pumping fuel into airplanes out of them. The first 2 years I flew were almost entirely out of drums, and flew about 1,000 hours. So that's on a 985 at 20 gallons an hour. That's a lot of drums and a lot of pumps. And that was the Anaconda's Beaver EYT in that winter of 69. The spring and fall were busy times for Laurentian operating. As I said, we operated about 20 float planes, and then of course there was customer airplanes as well. So there might be as many as another 10 airplanes that required changeovers. It's 8 miles from Uplands to Rockcliffe. And Rockcliffe was a military aerodrome at that time, so we had rights to the seaplane base, but you couldn't use the airport. So in the fall, it was a fly them all up onto the grass and do the changeover, and in the spring, launch them off of a dolly. And you can see here's a Cessna sitting on Laurentian's dolly, and there's a lot of different types of dollies, but that particular one was copied from what de Havilland used. We had a lot of diverse operations. John Lang's on this call, and John's going to think this is a little strange to see only a 180-gallon tank. John spent a full career flying as the most senior tanker pilot for Con Air. So this doesn't go very far, but you could put out small spot fires with it. And in addition to water bombing, there was a lot of survey work. We operated a large fleet of particularly beavers, an L-19 and otters, and all doing low-level magnetometer and other survey work, carrying birds and that sort of thing. So we had people all over the country. Our main operations, of course, were charter and air taxi, but there were some Class 3 skeds, some limited Class 3 skeds that we used on a unit toll operation as well. As I said, our main operations were up in the Shefferville area. Alexandria Terziev is on this call, and her father, Mark Terziev, was a World War II B-24 pilot. He was an avid sportsman and photographer. And as I was researching my book and looking for permission to use some photographs I had, I contacted Alexandra and her daughter, Catherine Greenleaf in Chicago. Alex is in upstate New York, Rochester, I believe. And they very graciously provided me with just a ton of photographs from their dad and grandfather. And I'm going to show a little film clip of what operations were like in the this one is in 1965, and so this is a courtesy of Mark Terziev. But just before we show that film, I'm going to show. I just put this in prior to this one as well, and there's on the right hand. If you go down the right hand side, the fourth guy with the red beard. Is I don't know, does anybody recognize him? That's Patty Gardner, and he's the founder of your chapter of the Canadian Aviation Historical Society. So this was in 1969, and this was our bunkhouse and kitchen, and Patty was up there. The other fellow, some of you Ottawa folks might recognize, is the other fellow with the beard on the left-hand side of the table, and his name is Eddie Patton. He's a Brit. He's an AME, a maintenance engineer. And after retiring, leaving Laurentian, he spent a lifetime with the National Aviation Museum in Ottawa. And he became the assistant curator of the museum. The curator is primarily an administrative person. Eddie was the active guy that set up a lot of the displays. And so even that display of the beaver, he set up. Now, I give him a bad time about that because he's got the canoe tied on the wrong side as far as I'm concerned, but he said he took artistic license on that for setting it up. So here we go. We're now going to go to Ungava. And by the way, that picture was taken over Ungava in 1969. I was flying the airplane, and Patty Gardner was in a Cessna 180 with the door off that took the picture. So we're now going to start in upstate New York, and we're headed up into the Ungava area with Mark Terziev and a couple of other guys, Stan Karbowski and one of his other fellows. And they go into Montreal, up the St. Lawrence, and into Shefferville, get on a Beach 18 on floats and head off up to the Whale River. So here we go. This is the Whale River, 1965. Premier salmon fishing area, and they from 65 on, they had quite an established camp up in here. Mark shows you a chart and uses a stick to start out in upstate New York, up through Montreal, down the St. Lawrence to Sept-Îles, Seven Islands, up the railroad to Wabush, into Shefferville, and then on up onto the Whale River, about 100 miles short of the Arctic Ocean. Why don't you see the guys on the ramp in Montreal carrying a rifle down the ramp in Montreal, getting on an airplane? You sure as hell wouldn't see that now. This is a Quebec Air F-27, and they're headed up to Sept-Îles. Smoking was still pretty common in the cockpit in those days. Stewardesses were still stewardesses before they were flight attendants, and you could get up in the cockpit and enjoy the flight. We're on final to landing northbound at Sept-Îles. This is the terminus of the railroad. Railroad runs 350 miles north to the richest iron ore deposits in North America. On taxiing in, you'll see that DC-3s are still pretty prominent. You'll see Hollinger Ungava Transport DC-3, and they helped build the railroad and the a lot of the towns up in the air. It was all done by air. You could still walk around on a ramp and take pictures. Here's F-27 landing at Wabush, Labrador City, before it's paved. Going to come back to it. You're going to see an Eastern Provincial Airways Handley Page Herald on the side there as well. There's the Handley Page. This is on the way into Shefferville. Big mines up on the left. Town on there with Knob Lake. This is where Premier Duplessis died. Runway's not paved yet, and it's the old terminal, Quebec Air's terminal. Being greeted by Ted Bennett, base manager, and he's base manager here at Squaw Lake. And that's old Romeo Echo, Beach 18. Now we carried canoes on almost all our flights. Everything up there is, there's a canoe. The beach is a little different because you can, there's no spreader bars on the beach, so you can put it underneath and you crank it right up underneath to the belly. There's Labrador Mining and Exploration. Red Beaver was off on the left. There's FHP, that's Papa. That's, I've got a fair amount of time in that airplane. That's another very early airplane, an early Beaver. Now these guys are all World War II vets. The two fellows on the left, Stan Karboski, and the fellow in the red hat, they're both ex-US Army Rangers. As I said, Alex Terziev was in the US Air Force. The shot of the bunkhouse going out. Fly over the native village and beach headed north. This is the Labrador Trough. You can see the lakes are all striated in the same way, and the retreating glaciers pulled all of the scored the land. This is the land that God gave to Cain. It was all scrub bush and rock. Ted Bennett was a canceled pilot during the Second World War, based out of Newfoundland, and spent a lot of time on anti-submarine patrols. And he's getting ready to land here at the Whale River, about 100 miles south of the Arctic Ocean. Some good shots of the beach, and we'll see a few more in these. I'm going to let this run another couple of minutes. Talked about canoes. This isn't a particularly big canoe. It's about a 17-foot V stern, but you don't move anywhere in this country unless it's by canoe or airplane. It's almost impossible to travel overland. Ted's caught himself a mess of fish for a stopover. And it wouldn't take very long. The fishing in this country is just absolutely incredible. That's just a few minutes of fishing. Going to see a great shot of Ted taking off in the beach. He was a real artist with it. He was base manager, so he chose the flights. If there was a flight down to Goose Bay to the American base and the PX, we didn't get to go on that. Ted would take it with the beach. He'd go down there and he'd come back full of cigarettes and booze. I'm going to let this run for another minute or so. I want to show you a bush camp. This is a pretty typical bush camp that we serviced and stayed in a lot of occasions. You're going to see Stan Karboski up a tree. And what he's doing is he's stringing an HF radio antenna. We didn't use VHF radios there very much at all, but we had very good communications with HF. And Alex, I think this is actually your dad, Mark, that's on the radio right here. It's the only picture that we see of him. But we had very good HF communications through the whole area. So that just gives you a real idea of 1965 in the Ungava area and what it was like. Carrying canoes was, as I said, was almost every flight. You'll see on this, this is a Fecto rack. They held the STC on it. It's an inverted V that goes from the floats up to the strut, and the canoe is actually carried on the outside of the float and outside of the arc of the propeller. The other thing is that there isn't as much turbulence over the horizontal stabilizer of the airplane when it's out a little bit further. This is our base at Shefferville. That's a Mark Terziev shot, a great shot of the otter. That otter is Victor Quebec Delta, and that's the last otter off the production line. And I flew that airplane for a couple of years. Nice picture of the beach. That's our bunkhouse. I lived there for 4 years. A dispatch and a freight shed at one end, and kitchens and lavatories down at the other end. Everything's it's iron ore country, so everything's red. It's either red mud or red dust all the time. Was a little time for relaxation once in a while, not very often, but this was on an exploration trip to set up a new outfitters camp up just inland on the Delay River, just inland from the Arctic coast in Ungava Bay, and that's John Bogey sitting down in the chair. And I don't catch very much fish, so I was pretty proud of that fish. The Caribou Hunt in September was one of the big money makers. If you were from out in Labrador and in Newfoundland and in Quebec, if you're a resident hunter, you can go to any lake you want to, and we had a lot of those. But then if you were from out of province or out of country, then you had to go through an outfitter. But the weather in September is pretty raw up there. It's starting to snow a lot of the time. Freeze up the 1st of October, so it's pretty daunting country. This is Sag Lac Fjord out in the Labrador coast. We didn't get out there very often, but occasionally we did, and you can see it's pretty bleak and barren country. This is just about as far northeast. It's not very much further up to the tip of Labrador, and in July, even finding a place to land. There's pack ice out there, and Ray Hocko on this call. Ray's got lots of time up in this country. There's even some icebergs out there, but this is pretty daunting place for a young Ontario farm boy to be out there for the first time, hanging on the end of a big old round engine. And if that sucker quits, you're in for a lot of bad times. This is up in the mouth of the George River. I can't pronounce the Inuit name for this place, but it's George River Settlement, or Port Nouveau, Quebec. And there's a Ford Island is where we were there. The fellow in the front, his name is William Mutluck. He was the band chief, and nobody spoke English, so there was an Anglican priest that was doing the interpreting. And this is the community that our Governor General Mary Simon is from, and I visited this community a number of times over the years. This is over on Hudson's Bay. Cape Jones was a mid-Canada radar site. It's right at the point where on the east side of the bay, where James Bay and Hudson's Bay meet together. And I was in 1973, I was up there at the Grumman Goose doing a polar bear survey. We did a grid over the lower portion of Hudson's Bay and just about all of James Bay, one side to the other at 200 feet over the pack ice. This is Coarjapik, great whale, or Post de Baleine. And there's a lady, she's preparing seal skins. This is over the Gatineau River near Wakefield. This was the 35th anniversary of Laurentian Air Services. That would have been 1971. For guys like Jack DeBrise and the military folks, they're pretty used to formation flying. This picture was taken by a famous Ottawa photographer, Hans Blom. So he's in a Cessna 180, but to get the 4 airplanes and get the 3 of them all in the same frame took a heck of a long time. If you see that the Otters, I was flying the Otter, it's got a water bombing tank on it, and about 80 miles per hour is about the most it could make. The Goose was just about falling out of the sky. So, but it's kind of a neat picture on the Gatineau River when they still had log booms on the river in 71. The Queen of the Laurentians fleet was the Grumman Goose BXR. There she is in her new paint job in 73. We had a base that we started up in Wabush and Labrador City. Did some work over in Churchill Falls at that time in the winter time, and we kept we generally had a beaver or an otter base there, and on the beaver dock, on the beaver pond. In the early 70s, Laurentian started operating DC-3s as part of the Bay James project, both on wheels and skis. And there's a pretty good shot up of Shefferville, and these were mostly fuel hauls, but they hauled everything in. I remember hauling a D8 cat blade in the back of a DC-3. It had been a passenger machine, so there was no real proper tie down. So you're using passenger seat rails to tie this cat blade in the back. If you ever had to come to a sudden stop, it was coming forward for sure. In 1973, after the float season, I left Laurentian. And the federal government was starting up Airtransit, and it was at that time the federal government owned de Havilland of Canada, and they were starting on the project to build the Dash 7, and so they were going to market not only the Dash 7 to the world as a STOL airplane, but a whole package that went along with it that included navigation, marketing, and the whole package. So I have a whole presentation I do on Airtransit, but we're going to just take a short look at it. And there's about I'm going to run about 3 minutes of a film on here. It's a 20-minute film, but I'm only going to run 3 minutes of it. You have to excuse the quality of it. It's 50 years old, but so the video is not great, but the audio gives you a good presentation of what was happening.
Looking at the problem faced by just about everyone who travels by air to the airport. Some of these travelers will take off for destinations thousands of miles away, perhaps overseas, but over half of them will actually fly less than 500 miles. And the fact is, they will spend about 2/3 of their total trip time on the ground. That's one thing, but there's another. The number of air travelers is growing at an increasing rate. It's an accelerating burden on airport facilities. And despite bigger transport aircraft, traffic at airports is still increasing. Airport capacity at some points is becoming limited by air congestion. How How can we cut down the airport problem? Reduce the time spent getting there and scrambling for baggage and jostling through crowds and waiting. Canada is demonstrating a practical short takeoff and landing concept that can relieve the problem in either of two simple ways. One is to introduce short takeoff and landing runways at existing airports and take advantage of the better maneuverability and other flight characteristics of STOL aircraft. The other is to shift short-haul routes to STOL ports. That's what Canada has done. It's a success, and in the next 20 minutes, we'll show how it works. From the start, at 0730 hours, July 24th, 1974, Canada's STOL demonstration has been a success. Only a few months into operation, it was running at 65% capacity during the week, and that's with 60 flights every weekday. The Canadian STOL demonstration runs between Ottawa and Montreal. Total block distance, 110 miles. The idea works so well because everything's streamlined in a full-service system. Port is small. There's less land needed, and lower cost, and much lower maintenance. Because STOL ports are close to urban centers, the total trip cost is actually lower. This, plus the saving in time, makes it attractive to business travelers. For operators, the investment in aircraft, maintenance, land, and taxes is appealing compared with the usual airline run from the average airport. A man hops a comfortable minibus downtown near his office, takes about a 5-minute run to the STOL port, and goes right on his plane. 45 minutes later, he's on the ground again.
So that gives you a little introduction into to the STOL service and the concept. I joined them in December 1973. That's young Tim in the back row, fourth from the right, and kind of a loud check jacket and kind of a loud tie. It was a really amazing operation. It was an airline that was started from scratch and went into full bore service. It was a partnership between Transport Canada and Air Canada were the two primary folks in it, but the Transportation Development Agency and a lot of other government agencies were in it. There were 48 pilots to start with. All of the captains were ex-military, and all of the first officers, with one exception, were all from a commercial background. The training was done on a military pipeline type of situation, and it was very structured. The initial checkout on the airplane was 6 weeks, and people from the industry saying, "Holy mackerel, 6 weeks to check out on a Twin Otter is pretty extensive." But that included not only the highly modified airframe on the Twin Otter, but the navigation. At the time, it was an area an area navigation system. GPS is very common now, but it wasn't common in those days. Microwave landing systems. It was quite an operation. There's the modified Twin Otter Airtransit. There were 6 of them that were identical over Parliament Hill. I happened to be on either that airplane or the one that was doing the photo shoot on the day that one was taken. Jack, I don't know whether you were on that or not. Montreal downtown STOL port was what it was really all about. It was a 2,000-foot runway with a 100-foot overrun at each end. It had all of the accoutrements. It was about I think about a 7-minute ride to downtown Montreal. People say 2,000 feet for a Twin Otter. Wow, that's a lot of room. But the airplanes were not operated to FAR 23, but were operated to FAR 25 airline standards. So the airplane could take off and during the takeoff roll lose an engine at a critical time and still have time to reject on the runway. And most small airplanes don't work like that. That's the way airlines work. And of course, it was all predicated on going to the Dash 7. Here's Ottawa, and this is pretty interesting for you Ottawa folks. The 3 World War II hangars in the background is where the museum was located. The buildings that are in the front, the one on the right-hand side was the terminal and dispatch. That building still exists. It's now the National Museum's administrative building. The hangar was built to accommodate 3 Twin Otters, and that is the workshops for the museum. And the other building down at the end, I'm not sure whether it's still there or not, but it was a maintenance hall and fire hall. But it sure gives you a pretty good view of what it was. There were the 6 modified Twin Otters to meet airline standards. Excuse me. Had modified electrical systems. They had spoilers on them, ground spoilers, anti-skid brakes, backup air brakes, and this navigation system. It was a VHF UHF area nav system. It was state of the art at the time. You can see a card being fed into it. It was an optical reader that went over a spindle. And if you watch the rest of that little promotional film, at some point in there, they describe this and they say, this computer can take 96,000 bits of information. So in today's, your telephone has so much more capability in that. You got to remember that this in the 70s, this was before personal computers. A computer would take up a full room. So it was state of the art at the time. The co-scan down on the side, those are 6 degree, those are the receivers for the microwave landing system. A normal landing system is a 3 degree glide path, and this was a 6 degree glide path. Bug speeds on the way down were 68 knots if you were light, or 72 knots if you were heavy. And these are speeds that in the realm of helicopters. So this was cutting edge technology. The en route accuracy was they wanted 0.2 of a mile from centerline, and you were on a profile at all time, and they wanted 50 feet on that. We would go through the center of the Montreal airport, 66 flights a day, up to 66 flights a day, and you didn't have to talk to anybody. It was it was all done on automatic transponder codes, and the integrity of the navigation was such that that's what they counted on that. The Dash 7 was under construction. As I said, it was owned by the Canadian government, and all of this was, although it was called a demonstration service, it was all geared to go and to expand. And we were the cadre that was going to expand it. It all came to a sudden stop in January of 1976. To all pilots, it is with regret that we have to inform you that Airtransit Canada was advised by the Ministry of Transport that the STOL demonstration passenger service between Ottawa and Montreal will terminate on April 30th, 1976. Stop. This telegram therefore constitutes formal notice of such termination. Stop. H.G. Whitten, President, A.J. Tonkin, Director of Flight Operations. So from a full bore operation that was going to expand and keep going, that had a tremendous esprit de corps, here's 3 months notice, boys, you're shut down. It was very political. It was a government subsidized airline that was running between the two cities, carrying more than 100,000 passengers. And with all of the accoutrements that were attached to it, there was no way that it could make money the way it was. The first flight of the Dash 7 was in 1975, and the first delivery was not until 78. So they would have had to run a government subsidized airline that was losing money for at least another 2 years before the Dash 7 could even become available. And so this is what helped come to its demise. I was after 13 months, I moved up as a captain. I was the civilian captain out of it. Everyone else was military. And I'm going to read you just a little excerpt out of the book that talks about the operation. And it's called A War Zone and a Mile High Adventure. I very much enjoyed the 2.5 years with Airtransit. This work broadened my IFR skills and introduced me to a more disciplined way of flying than I had been used to in the bush. The new technologies, precision flying, and the challenging low-level weather ensured that the work was anything but boring while plying the routes back and forth between Ottawa and Montreal. In the day-to-day operations of a commuter airline, there are always occurring events that are out of the norm of earthbound folks, which makes a pilot's life interesting. I would like to share 2 of these experiences with you. One was frightening to observe, and the other was, well, rather bizarre. In the day-to-day operations of a commuter airline, there are always occurring events that are out of the norm of earthbound folks, which makes a pilot's life interesting. I'd like to share 2 of these experiences with you. One was frightening to observe, and the other was, well, rather bizarre. In 1974, there was an illegal strike by Montreal firefighters that the newspapers dubbed the Red Weekend. 140 fires were reported burning out of control in the city. It was alleged that some of the fires, particularly those in the old vacant warehouses, were deliberately set. I have always had a historical interest in World War II aviation, and of course the bombing raids on Britain and Germany play a dominant role in any films or description of that era. The mind's eye recalls vivid pictures of large areas of the cities on fire while bombers trudge overhead, trying to avoid the fireballs of flak that rose up to meet them or to avoid defending night fighters. During the 1974 Red Weekend, except for the columns of smoke, the skies were clear over the city of Montreal. I flew several night flights over the city at between 2,000 and 4,000 feet above the fires. While the fires were not obviously as devastating as wartime, and there was a lack of flak and night fighters, the scene of many large unchecked fires glowing in the night in Canada's second largest city was absolutely shocking. I can only imagine the wartime carnage in the cities and the shock and fear experienced by both those on the ground and those in the air. The sight of large portions of the city on fire drove home the frightening aspects of human conflict, be it in wartime or with peacetime political and labor strife. It was a sobering and unforgettable experience. The second escapade was also at night and on the last departure from the Montreal STOL port for a flight to Ottawa. Our only passengers on this flight were a gentleman and a lady that were well dressed in business attire. Jim, the comedian, and my co-pilot made the bilingual announcements on our short taxi out to the takeoff area. Just prior to pushing up the throttles, Jim made a last-minute visual check of the cabin and started to giggle. We continued the takeoff, and after getting airborne, selecting the flaps up, setting climb power, and contacting Montreal terminal control, I asked Jim, "What's so funny?" He told me that the lady had her skirt hiked up, her shoes off, and was reaching across the aisle with her foot and was massaging the gentleman's leg. Okay. It's been a long day, and maybe it's time for a little levity. I told Jim to turn off the cabin lights and to close the sliding cockpit doors. They were a pocket type of door that are on slides and meet in the middle. Now, the cabin was not completely dark, as there were lights over both the main and emergency exits. But I suppose these supplied mood lighting. The Twin Otter's cockpit is not really roomy, but the pilot seats are elevated, and there's a step down into the well that is located between the two seats. This well area is where we kept a large pilot's briefcase with all the publications and documents. Jim removed the briefcase and strapped it into his co-pilot seat. He maneuvered himself down into this well, where he knelt down on the floor for a voyeur's view of the cabin through the crack in the doors. Now, at this time of night, during the last flight, things were pretty slow at the two STOL ports in Montreal and Ottawa. At each site, there would have been two station agents, a dispatcher, a van driver, a ramp attendant, a night shift mechanic, and an air traffic controller. There was also another crew in flight and heading eastbound to Montreal. So all in all, there were about 15 folks on duty. On this night, they were all glued to the company's dispatch radio. I was flying and communicating with air traffic control. And meanwhile, Jim, the comedian, was on the company radio giving a running commentary of the proceedings in the cabin of our aircraft in the night skies over the eastern Canadian winter landscape. That night on this 40-minute flight, we gave a bit of an early pre-landing announcement to ensure that the cabin was all in order. The cabin and the cockpit were all ship-shape prior to landing. On arrival at the station, all the station staff were lined up on the tarmac to greet the arriving celebrities. Jim and I exited the front doors to join the clapping Airtransit honor guard as our passengers came down the air stairs, bowing and waving like royalty as the new members of the Mile High Club. I didn't have the heart to tell them that we were only at 4,000 feet. Well, 2 weeks after I flew the second last flight between Ottawa and Montreal, I was flying Twin Otters out of Vancouver, Victoria, and Nanaimo Harbor. And that was the move to the West Coast. I've been here for about 46 years since, and still flying away at it. So there's the book, Tight Floats and Tailwinds, and I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. It was a real treat for me to talk to the folks in Ottawa as an Ottawa hometown boy. If you're interested in getting the book, you can buy it direct from me. That's how you can get it. Or you can get it through the Canadian Aviation Historical Society, through Rachel, and it's there's a small discount on it, and there's a couple of bucks goes to the Canadian Aviation Historical Society as well. So once again, thank you very much, and wish you tight floats and tailwinds.